After the end of the Civil War, which left the United States a major military power, no realist believed it possible any longer to defend Canada against serious American attack. This meant that the new Canadian Confederation of 1867 could only survive if the United States found it acceptable. But the new Dominion clearly intended to become a second transcontinental nation which would block for good any American chances of expanding northward. Greater nations have rarely allowed lesser ones to occupy adjacent empty territory, and after 1867, moreover, there were significant groups of Americans who did want all or part of British America. Yet, 5 years after Confederation, Canada had reached the Pacific, and the Canadian fact was accepted in Washington. This acceptance was the larger implication of the important Treaty of Washington, which in 1871 settled outstanding Anglo-American differences. Britain was eager to withdraw from North America, but she wanted also to leave behind a Canada that could survive American pressure. Only a transcontinental Canadian Confederation could do this if Americans accepted it. American expansionists had not succeeded in converting Congress, but Congress and public opinion did very much want to end the British bases on their northern border. Thus, most Americans were willing to agree that Britain's departure removed the chief objection to Canada. And by allowing Canada to expand westward without interference, the United States accepted the historical and moral claims of Canada as the legitimate successor to British North America. But Canadians did not grasp these larger issues and were angry because the treaty involved Canadian sacrifices. The Canadian Prime Minister, however, argued that sacrifices for Anglo-American harmony were justified. American hostility to Britain had tended to rub off on Canada. American goodwill could do the same. Certainly, goodwill was now in fashion.
After all these years, my dear. Grant re-elected. Well, Miss Canada, he's not such a bad chap once you know him, despite the cigars. There was a reminder of basic Canadian-American interdependence when President Grant journeyed in 1871 to meet the Canadian Governor-General and open a railroad which linked Halifax and St. John to Montreal via Portland, Maine. Late in 1871, a terrible American disaster occurred, the Chicago Fire. For the benefit of the tens of thousands of homeless and destitute refugees, London authorized military authorities in Canada to make extensive military stores available to the stricken city, a gesture that was deeply appreciated. The new friendship between Uncle Sam and John Bull made Fenians feel distinctly out of fashion. Already, some Fenian warriors had found themselves firmly conveyed to American jails. Fenianism had found supporters in anti-British troublemakers like Ben Butler. He and his friends were hardly cheered by Anglo-American reconciliation, which left them wondering whether the troubled waters of Irish politics were still worth fishing in. In October 1871, in Manitoba, Canadian forces were called out for the last time to guard against rumored Fenian attack. A Hudson's Bay post on the border did have some strange visitors. This time, the American authorities got there first. Young Manitoba survived. It was in Manitoba, too, that the signing of treaties with the Crees and Chippewas in late 1871 pointed up the contrast between Canadian and American relations with the Indians. South of the border, bloodshed accompanied the swiftly advancing American frontier. And sometimes the aftermath seemed merely another kind of death. By contrast, north of the border, paternal but friendly relations generally prevailed. Gifts and annuities sought to carry on the tradition of the Hudson's Bay Company, which had valued the Indian way of life. After lengthy debate, the Indian chiefs agreed to give up general title to the land in return for specific reserved areas.
The Indians of the prairies had little enough reason to like any authority which replaced that of the Hudson's Bay Company. Unlike the company, any such authority was bound to be chiefly concerned with settlement. Nonetheless, government paternalism, which at least seemed intent on maintaining some place for the Indian way of life, was preferable to hopeless conflict with oncoming settlement. So the peopling of the Canadian West could now proceed peacefully. Canadians can take pride in the relative absence in their West of the bloodshed that marred the American frontier. But in making comparisons, they should remember the very different pace of development in the two Wests. There were American treaties, too, with good intentions. But the sheer speed of the American advance often frustrated the best-made treaties. Anglo-American reconciliation, Fenian decline, the securing of the West, all these events did reduce certain Canadian-American irritations. But what about that bogey annexationism, the desire to join the United States?
The ambiguity in the feelings of many Canadians towards the American eagle had been cleared up a bit by recent American attitudes. Since the Civil War, Uncle Sam, many Canadians felt, had been riding a high horse indeed. His arrogance showed clearly in the inflation of war damage claims against Britain. Sam was a slick one, they felt, out to get the suckers. In fighting annexationism, MacDonald had an ally in French nationalism, which saw it as a deadly trap. The cutting of Catholic ties with Rome, advocated by much American opinion, was anathema to the French-Canadian clergy. Pastoral letters were read in Quebec churches, warning against the annexationist movement, which would lead to the certain destruction of French nationality. In the maritime provinces of the Dominion, there had been a change in the outlook of politicians. Commissioners were now being appointed to press claims on the new Canada. For Confederation was clearly here to stay, and Ottawa, not London or Washington, was the place to negotiate with. Better terms was the slogan, and federal leaders were left in little doubt that the cure for lurking annexationism was money. Halifax, the great Nova Scotia seaport and commercial center, already had rail connection with Montreal, but it was via the European and North American Railroad, which ran through St. John, New Brunswick, and continued on American soil through Maine. An all-Canadian route was urgent. Completion of a railroad between Halifax and Quebec had been promised with Confederation, and now it was pushed ahead. Political unity, not profit, was clearly the motive, for it took a roundabout route as far from the United States as possible. Maritime fishermen had not relished the sight of the American Secretary of State proudly displaying his prize catch at the Treaty of Washington, their fish. On the fisheries seesaw, they felt on the wrong end of the deal, even though an effort had been made to balance things up with free entry of Canadian fish into the United States. But Uncle Sam, too, felt he was being robbed when arbitrators at Geneva finally awarded Canada $5.5 million in compensation for her fisheries. The balancing act between the two nations' fisheries wasn't easy. Meanwhile, both sides fished.
The history of Canada's relations with the United States falls into three periods: a period of war, a period of near war and fear of war, and a period of peaceful relations. Just as the year 1818 was the dividing line between the periods of war and Cold War, so the year 1871 marked the watershed between Cold War and normal relations. It was the year of Anglo-American reconciliation, of Fenian decline, and the year when Canada reached the Pacific. It was also the year when annexationism faded. American high-handedness had helped this decline. When Americans were bellicose over the Alabama damage claims against Britain and silent about Canada's Fenian damage claims against the United States, even pro-Americans were angry. But the main reason for annexationism's decline was the easing of the commercial depression which had followed the loss of reciprocity. An American historian has said that the annexationist movement in Canada was a response not to the Liberty Bell, but to the cash register. It wilted, therefore, in the warm rays of reviving prosperity. A lessening of regional grievances also helped. British Columbia and the Maritimes now had solid prospects for railways, and the free entry of Canadian fish into the United States did help Nova Scotia. It was just as well that annexationism was in eclipse. It had tended to foster illusions among American expansionists who were apt to mistake it for a grassroots rather than a businessman's movement. If any such movement ever did encourage American interference, Canada would now face it alone. Canada and Britain had long differed on the size of their respective roles in the defense of Canada. Canada had felt that hostility toward her in the United States arose largely from British policies, and that her defense was, therefore, largely a British responsibility. But now, Anglo-American reconciliation had opened a new era.
Prospects for the future on this first new year after the Treaty of Washington did seem to Britain more pleasing. But from Canada's vantage point, the view was rather different. John Bull could now worry about Europe and India and leave the worrying in North America to little Johnny Canuck. Through the streets of Quebec, the remnants of the Imperial military presence had been rumbling to the salvage dumps for disposal. The debris was considerable, for there had been thousands of British regulars in Canada. Now that the prospects for peace were better, Canada was not particularly keen to spend much on defense. So Canada's armed forces remained on a modest scale and depended heavily on volunteer and militia organizations. There were very few regular troops at first, chiefly 2 artillery regiments. The guardians of the border were far fewer in number now, and the modernization of defense works like the American Fort Montgomery on Lake Champlain and new Canadian forts near Quebec was stopped. After 1871, the forts rapidly became obsolete. An agreeable somnolence now hung over them as they sank to the status of historical monuments. But at Halifax in Nova Scotia and Esquimalt in British Columbia, Britain did retain naval bases, which aided the operations of the world's largest navy. Canadians knew that this mighty power off their coasts discouraged any nation from trifling with a British ally. A confident Miss Canada, clad in all the trappings of national independence, was in vogue in 1872. But skeptics had a perhaps more accurate picture. The youngster's first independent steps could easily lead him into the waiting arms of an interested uncle. Loyalists felt that the troublesome colonial children still needed a political guardian, and that Mother Britannia should be less absorbed in her military affairs and more devoted to her charges. The ladder of colonial development, they complained, which John Bull had climbed to imperial greatness, was now being thrust aside by anti-imperialists like Gladstone. Liberal England was chiefly interested in wooing America and knew that the anti-imperial tune pleased her. The imperialists of Canada felt that the notion of independence was premature and that cutting all ties with Britain was dangerous. Independence was a perilous venture, and Canada would drift into the Union unless imperialists stopped it. So when Lord Dufferin, the new Governor-General, arrived in 1872, many Canadians saw him as the symbol of a still vital connection. It was the security derived from being part of a mighty empire that made many Canadians so eager to keep the old flag flying.
Shall we break the plight of youth and pledge us to an alien love? No, we'll hold our faith and truth, trusting in the God above. Stand, Canadians, firmly stand, round the flag of fatherland. Stand, Canadians, firmly stand, round the flag of fatherland.
That song, incidentally, was called Empire First, a Canadian marching song. The title was pretty revealing. The fervid imperial sentiment which English Canadians continued to display after ceasing to be a colony may seem puzzling. Macdonald himself, looking ahead in 1872, foresaw Canada as the right arm of Britain and a powerful auxiliary for the empire. Yet the same Macdonald thought the notion that Canadians should take orders from Englishmen simply ridiculous. But at the same time, he called the idea that Canadians were ready for independence simply nonsense. The contradiction is less baffling if we remember how conscious responsible Canadians were of their weakness and isolation in North America. The United States was very powerful, and Canadians were uneasy. The desire to stop being a scapegoat for British sins against the US was reason enough to accept Britain's withdrawal from North America. But the danger of American hostility to Canada on her own account was reason enough not to cut all ties. So Canada sought autonomy, not independence, within the larger framework of the British Empire. But there was a movement for full independence in Canada at this time, and its connection with annexationism was revealing. Professed annexationists had become distinctly less popular in Canada by 1872, so many of them joined the independence movement. They weren't necessarily being deceitful. They honestly did not believe that Canada could make it on its own, and that independence would simply be a first step toward union with the United States. So, with well-known annexationists praising independence and an American consul general sitting on the movement's inner council, the pro-British press denounced the whole idea as traitorous. The fact that advocates of annexationism and the advocates of independence could get mixed up so easily was ominous. It clearly revealed a considerable uncertainty about the whole idea of Canada. In the United States itself, the widespread belief that most Canadians were secret annexationists waiting for American action had receded, and many influential Americans also felt that Canada's problems guaranteed her entry into the Union anyway. Still, some were not above trying to help the process along.
The Canadian youngster was still very much an object of interest to American expansionists, including Ulysses Grant. As a general, Grant had preferred the straightforward approach, but as president, his tactics for winning Canada had to be more roundabout. The key was reciprocity, and Uncle Sam was well aware that there was nothing the young nation wanted so badly. Well, little chap, if we don't give it to you, maybe you will be smart enough to know where you can find it. In your Uncle Sam's arms. A depressed Canada, said annexationists, would soon be forced by unemployment and misery to seek a better life by joining the Union. But hardship in Canada tended to have a different result. The teeming cities of the Union, already now a nation of 40 million strong, offered those willing to take a risk almost unlimited opportunities. And the immigration policies of the United States now made entry easier than ever. Canada might not join the Union, but an alarming number of Canadians did. From Chicago, the great Midwestern commercial hub, an ever-increasing torrent of wheat and other produce flowed eastward. The great Erie-Hudson water route was now reinforced by a complex and efficient network of fiercely competing railroads. This formidable transportation system was centered on New York and helped funnel a preponderance of the Western trade through its magnificent port, which was always ice-free. Ice-clogged and dangerous by contrast, the St. Lawrence was unusable several months of the year, a crippling disadvantage for Montreal, New York's rival. In fact, any kind of movement at all during the winter months was quite an achievement for Canadians. Sometimes it was wiser just to stay home, a place which those who came to Canada saw a lot of during the long, cold winter months. Meanwhile, the American railroads were moving settlers across the upper Mississippi into the American prairies. The Northern Pacific, undaunted by severe winter problems, pushed on to the west, not very far from the Canadian border. Soon, the rich American lands adjacent to Canada would be teeming with settlers. Canada's railroad builders faced far greater difficulties. Getting there wasn't always half the fun for Canadians. Over 1,000 miles of rock and forest blocked access to the Canadian West. 1,000 miles of prairie had to be crossed. And then came the greatest obstacle of all. "700 miles of towering mountains challenged MacDonald's brash promise of a railroad to the Pacific coast. In the United States, a strong nationalism, a sense of national purpose was now dominant. The spokesman of national unity loved to dwell on the peace and harmony now prevailing, in contrast to the terrible strife of the war between the states. As America approached her second century, let the world note that the Union was again one and indivisible. The nation was supremely confident that it had confirmed the great heritage of the Revolution and the national vision of the Founding Fathers. So when the new Dominion appeared, it was not surprising that Columbia, so sure of herself, regarded the Canadian debutante with a certain disbelief. The clever portrayers of national character, who had done so well with Uncle Sam, had trouble comprehending the new nation. Their difficulty was understandable, for Canada was two nations in one, and one of them was French in character. Though somewhat outside the mainstream of North American life, French Canada was a lively and flourishing fact. A powerful clergy had led the successful fight for survival and retained great influence. Indeed, religion had been a vehicle for a strong French-Canadian nationalism, which had helped the French fact hold its ground in Quebec. But many French Canadians were less sure how they would fare in the new Dominion, sharing the country with the aggressive, business-minded Anglo-Saxon. Protestantism was powerful in Ontario, the other great Canadian province, and among its adherents, many were hostile to Catholicism and to Quebec. The British element, they felt, should dominate the future development of the Dominion. What this concept of the Dominion could do to the merry-go-round of Canadian politics was now clear. Already, the federal power had found the Riel affair putting it at serious odds with Quebec. French leaders were deeply suspicious that the toppling of Riel in Manitoba showed that what the English leaders really wanted was an English Dominion. If nation building meant ignoring Canada's dual heritage, would the French support such a concept of confederation?
It was clear that the brave new Dominion from sea to sea had enough troubles to give annexationists on both sides of the border something to cling to. Canada's success as a nation was by no means certain. The two chief problems that loomed large and menacing before Canadians in that landmark year of 1872 were already the ones that most trouble Canadians today. Then, as now, the issue was whether Canada could achieve the two most audacious objectives of Confederation, the creation of an American-sized nation without a homogeneous nationality, and an American-style prosperity with national independence. Then, as now, failure could mean disintegration and absorption. In 1872, these problems were labeled Riel and reciprocity. The Dominion's first crisis, the resistance of the Métis in Red River to Canadian occupation, had ended quietly. The military expedition from Canada had met no opposition. The only bullets fired at them were paper ones, aimed by annexationist editors in Minnesota who knew the expedition ended any hope of swallowing Manitoba. When the troops reached Red River, there was no resistance. But the general amnesty which Riel had been led to expect had not come. Disappointed and suspecting the troops of punitive intentions, he fled to Minnesota. Riel's enforced flight angered his followers, and some of them were heard to cry, "Oh, for the states, the states." A few went even further. A petition was sent to President Grant asking him to intercede, ostensibly to protect Red River's freedom of choice, but also hinting that annexation might be preferable to Canadian imperialism. But the administration made no effort to exploit the situation. And when the states did come, in the form of the last Fenian raid, the Métis and their leaders, including Riel, supported the new Canadian government. Clearly, the vast majority of the French in the West had rejected the United States. After all, most of Riel's demands had finally been written into the Manitoba Act. The American Constitution would have offered a good deal less in the way of special guarantees. Despite their clear preference for Canada, there was still no general amnesty for the Métis leaders in 1872. Why? Riel's execution of a troublesome prisoner, Thomas Scott, had not helped. Scott was from Ontario, and an outcry for vengeance had arisen in that province. But there were bigger issues. For Ontario, Confederation had been largely a means of snatching the West from the advancing Americans and of making it a frontier for Ontario. In their view, the primitive, static society of the Métis would be a hindrance to the American-style development they planned for the West. Riel sensed that to survive, his people must be able to grow with the West in their own way. If French rights were secured, Quebec might also share in the development of the West, and his people would get support and reinforcement. In English Canada, patriots had been promoting a broader Dominion nationalism or Canadianism under the slogan, Canada First. But when faced with the French fact in the new territories, the Canada Firsters quickly identified themselves with Ontario expansionism. It turned out that in their vision of the Dominion's future, expansion and colonization were peculiarly English tasks and privileges. There was no room in this vision for Riel, who was denounced as a rebel and obstructionist. When a general amnesty was denied and Riel fled, Canada Firsters boasted that they had robbed the French of their victory. But French nationalists in Quebec felt that Red River had been robbed of its natural leader. Never for a moment, they noted, had the Canada Firsters recognized the second nationality in Canada or considered that Western development might be an act of partnership. Canadianism, they felt, was simply English imperialism in disguise, and Confederation, outside Quebec at any rate, looked all too like the American-style nation-building they had persistently rejected. The other great problem facing Canadians was whether an American-style prosperity could be sustained without a large reciprocal trade with the United States. It was not really a new problem. Canada owed its very existence to the dogged pursuit of an independent northern economic system. But when Canadians recalled the brave and melancholy history of the Empire of the St. Lawrence, many felt skeptical indeed. The great river up which Cartier sailed had seemed to flaunt its own manifest destiny. It was the one great route to the marvelous network of waters in the interior, possession of which must surely mean mastery of the continent. Its mandate was irresistible. With breathtaking audacity, the French had used the river to win control over half the present area of the United States. But the blank, scarred face of the Precambrian shield was inescapable. It pressed against the very river base of the empire and kept its population hopelessly small. When 65,000 Frenchmen collided with 1.5 million New Englanders, the first empire of the St. Lawrence came to an end, as inevitable as was its beginning. But the irresistible mandate of the river remained. English merchants accepted it without question and began the long struggle to hold the great interior for their river. It was a dangerous game and helped to bring on the American Revolution. But the mandate of the river remained strong enough to keep the Montrealers aloof from the American system. But aloofness created a border which split the empire of the St. Lawrence in two. Despite Montreal's efforts to defy it, it had steadily hardened. Attempts to straddle it had helped to bring on the dangerous War of 1812, and the split was final. Led by the Nor'westers, Montreal then reached for the British Northwest and failed. Soon, Montreal and its river were struggling to win the trade of the lost American lands with new weapons, canals, and tariff concessions. But American canals and tariff concessions undermined the overextended Canadian system, and British free trade finished it off. When accumulated frustrations had driven the loyalist of the loyal, the merchants of Montreal, to cry also, "Oh, for the States, the States," it had seemed a final judgment on all empires of the St. Lawrence.
Although the new Dominion didn't seem to have much room to maneuver, the Canadian youngster did have a good head on his shoulders. His name was John A. Macdonald, politician and patriot. His labors for Confederation were already sufficient to make him the toast of his nation. Macdonald found little to be pessimistic about when he considered the Dominion as a producer of agricultural products. Canada was a prize winner. But Macdonald felt a lot less confident when he contemplated the chances for selling his surpluses. Canada still seemed to be begging, and the answer still seemed to be no. But Canada's own commercial leaders were no mere babes in arms, and many were getting fed up with Uncle Sam's negative attitude. Some thought it was time to look for other means of salvation. Macdonald agreed. The greatest supply of capital, the greatest industrial experience in the world were available to Canada from her imperial partner, Great Britain. But the power of the British pound, like the rising power of the American dollar, must be made to serve Canadian development, not stifle it. A high protective tariff, Macdonald felt, must be applied even against cheap British goods, as well as paying Uncle Sam back in his own coin. Only if these gentlemen put up their factories in Canada could they sell as they pleased in Canada. Macdonald was determined that, as much as possible, what Canadians bought in Canada should be made in Canada. Rapid industrialization, said Macdonald, must become the national policy of Canada. The tremendous West would play a vital role in the national policy for Canada. The new province of Manitoba must become the destination of immigrant farmers. Only when the West was properly peopled would Canada have a great home market like the United States. To succeed, this vast new Canada must be held together by railways. Only a transcontinental railway would enable Canada to pull away at last from her dangerous dependency on American communication. Canadian built and owned, the railway would give the St. Lawrence a hinterland. The commercial system of the St. Lawrence had existed since the earliest days. There had been endless hazards and disappointments as it struggled to share the great trade of the American interior. But the struggle had never been abandoned, and against many odds, Montreal had become a great commercial center. Now, the great port would truly flourish. In transcontinental Canada, the dream of an empire of the St. Lawrence would be fulfilled at last.
MacDonald was always at his best when promoting what came to be known as the national policy. He had to be, for there were plenty of skeptics. Some thought MacDonald's national economy simply one more version of the same alluring but unobtainable mirage which audacious Frenchmen, intrepid Nor'westers, and canny Montreal merchants had pursued in vain. MacDonald replied that Transcontinental Canada was different. For decades, the only frontier for Canadians had been the American. But now Canada controlled her own West. She had at last the same great complementary regions as the United States. The policies which were making America great, mass immigration, economic nationalism, industrialization, could now do the same for Canada. But MacDonald's critics said flatly that Canada was not the United States. MacDonald might have acquired some prairies, but 2 million square miles of Precambrian rock made up 2/3 of his dominion and wedged apart its settled regions. MacDonald's dreams were pretentious and dangerous, for an imitation United States would contrast badly with the real thing, and a backlash of pro-American sentiment would destroy Canada. A less grandiose but surer approach to Canadian prosperity was to convert the Americans back to reciprocity. Publicly, MacDonald did not deny the desirability of reciprocity, but privately, he was convinced that reciprocity could mean the death of an independent Canada. The greatest danger for Canada was her growing dependence on the United States, for this put her at the mercy of American goodwill, as congressional termination of reciprocity itself clearly showed. The partisans of close American connections now faced the choice of becoming perpetual beggars in Washington or annexationists. This argument is still going on today. MacDonald was a thoroughly unromantic patriot. He knew that his critics did not exaggerate the geographical odds against the Dominion, and he knew that no scarred wedge of Precambrian rock separating the settled regions of Canada would be as hard to bridge as the terrible wasteland of misunderstanding between two proud nations who had once been enemies. Yet, MacDonald was supremely confident. He had not taken on such liabilities without considering the assets. For if the liabilities were great, he knew the assets were greater still. And much there was, after all, to work with in these lands and peoples, first brought together by a common rejection of the American Revolution, people whose peculiar character had been tough enough to resist the attractions of a powerful and seductive union. What incalculable possibilities might lie concealed in the future association of these lands, of these peoples? Who were the Canadians? What were they like?
A majority of Canadians by now were of the durable breed who called themselves British. That could mean English Canadian. Great travelers and individualists. Great drinkers and brawlers. Great sportsmen and gamblers. Great fighters and churchgoers. Elegant, too, with the London look. It could mean Scotch Canadian, fiercely loyal and independent. It could mean Irish Canadians, who weren't Fenians. Canadian could also mean German Canadians, industrious and music-loving. And it had always meant French Canadian, with all that that meant. A unique people, sprightly and shrewd, with a profound reverence for the links of the past. a sincere devotion to lineage and clan. The powerful Roman Catholic Church felt that French survival was best guaranteed by traditionalism and the British monarchy. Inevitably, they saw the American eagle as a sinister creature indeed. In the Americans' popular democracy, they could see only the purchase of votes and cheap demagoguery. The spirit of the American Revolution had been trampled on, many other Canadians felt, and its great principles mocked by ruthless groups of self-seekers. The political hireling, the racist bigot, the robber baron, and crushed beneath their heels, the helpless Negro. The American eagle was given a predatory look by sinister groups. Manipulation of the vote made popular democracy a farce. With a gun on his hip, the man of violence was the true American hero. And the true American god was Mammon, who was worshipped shamelessly. The frantic pursuit of profit tyrannized American lives. Sam was seen as a dangerous tempter still, always ready with a sly hint to young Canada that there might be an easier way. Sam still had his eyes on the young Dominion, many feared. Wasn't she unattached now? But Sam was not the right suitor. Miss Canada would be wise to stay for a while longer yet with her own family. So imperial ties continued to be honored in Canada, a nation which was no longer a colony, but which was eager to be known as part of a mighty empire. Canada's leaders were determined to look British, even if it killed them.
An observant visitor in the early 1870s might have had difficulty in sensing that Canada had just entered a new and happier period in her relations with the United States, or that, strictly speaking, the struggle for a border was over. In actual fact, anti-American feeling in Canada was probably at an all-time high. If the Treaty of Washington had any larger significance, it was lost on Canadians who merely felt cheated out of reciprocity. To most, it was just one more example of American high-handedness, like the Fenian raids, the Trent episode, and so many others, all the way back to the Continental Congress and its friendly invasion of Canada in 1775. A century of war, threat of war, and Cold War had conditioned most ordinary Canadians to presume that America was immoral, aggressive, and expansionist, that her hostility was implacable, and her intentions annexationist. But was this drastic pessimism a fair assessment of American attitudes as a whole? The fact was that whatever individual Americans might advocate, American governments in their dealings with Canada had generally revealed a concept of their manifest destiny that was historically moral and realistic rather than adventurous and romantic. The populous American colonies did have a manifest destiny to advance westward across the mid-continent from their broad Atlantic base. Whoever got in the way of the process jeopardized the American future and invited war. New France blocked the path west, and there was war. British and Canadian lingering in the American path helped bring on the American Revolution, almost started war in 1794, and did help start one in 1812. And in 1846, though President Polk may have been bluffing when he claimed British Columbia, he was deadly serious about getting the mouth of the Columbia. But after the War of 1812, with the boundary confirmed and Western advance assured, Canada's unfriendly neighbor became less belligerent, although she frequently terrified Canadians by seeming to indulge her aggressive spokesman of manifest destiny. The United States never allowed them to chart the national course. Aggressive republicanism was dangerously rife among the hunters' lodges who wanted to help Canadian Republicans and among the Fenians who wanted to rid North America of British monarchy. But making the continent safe for republicanism never became an official crusade, nor did manifest destiny. But bringing the whole continent within the magic circle of the Union sounded fine during elections and on the 4th of July. Economic ambitions, which made some American regions anxious to acquire adjacent Canadian regions, produced serious annexationists. But Midwestern desire for the St. Lawrence and New England's desire for the maritime fisheries were satisfied by reciprocity, and the expansionists who wanted to acquire the British Northwest could not persuade fellow Americans that their cause was a vital national interest. Secretary of State Fish would have liked to annex Canada, but only if Canadians wished it, which for a while he thought they did. But when he was convinced they did not, he dismissed the whole idea. Officially, annexationism was dead. So, with no interference from Washington, Canada snatched the unoccupied remainder of the Great West, thereby ending forever all further American expansion northward. It was a somewhat miraculous ending. It had been lucky for Canada that when the United States had wanted to take her, she could not. But it was perhaps even luckier that when the United States could take Canada, she would not. The long struggle for a border is an instructive example of the most important process in the world, the historical progression from war through Cold War to friendship and the political mediation which brought it about. It can be done. So the struggle for a border came to an end. The undefended frontier was a reality at last. Mental disarmament, however, would take longer. Canadian suspicion of American annexationist intentions would die hard. Full acceptance of Canada in the United States would be slow and ungracious. It was unpleasantly clear that many leading Americans had accepted Canada only because they thought she could not survive. Perhaps they would be right. Ominous question marks hung over the second transcontinental nation. Economic depression could revive Canadian annexationism. English and French in Canada had had a common interest in resisting absorption by the United States. Could they continue to cooperate? Failure could still mean disintegration and absorption. Yet this was hardly the destiny for which 3 centuries of history had accumulated the marvelous heritage now spread out at last before Canadians, the monument to their past and the measure of their future, the great lands won and held in the long struggle for a border.